Well, good evening. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here tonight and to have you all at home as well. Thank you so much. And it is my great honor to introduce Professor Lisa Lickona. She was my professor over at St. Bernard's last semester, and I was telling her that every time I left her class, I just wanted to learn more and more. And we were in spiritual formation, and the saints it was so interesting. It was like a story every time we were there. She made them come alive. So I'm very excited to have you here tonight. Thank you for being with us. And now this semester, Professor Lickona is teaching Introduction to Theological Studies, and she's also teaching Grace, Nature, and Christian Anthropology. Professor Lickona has an extensive training in Catholic theology. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame and her master's degree in theological studies and licentiate in sacred theology from the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Families. That was a mouthful. She is an expert in the lives of the saints. For 8 years, she was the editor of Saints for the Magnificat and wrote daily on their lives. She has traveled throughout the U.S. presenting on the saints and Christian doctrine on humanity. So it is our privilege to have her here tonight to speak to us about the saints in the Eucharist.
I'm so happy to be here. I want to just start by saying if anybody is kind of in the back and they want to move forward, feel free. Like I want you to feel free to come up if you want to get a little closer. Well, Katie, that was a beautiful introduction, and it's just my great joy and pleasure to be able to give a talk like this. So when Katie offered me the opportunity, I jumped at it because I would say my favorite thing to talk about is the lives of the saints. As she mentioned, I had the great good fortune to be able to write about them every day for 8 years, and it was a truly transformative experience. And I hope I can give you a little taste of that by telling the stories that I'm going to tell tonight. There was a really beautiful write-up for this talk in the emails that went out, and it mentioned the fact that there are a lot of amazing, miraculous things that happened in the saints' lives that have to do with the Eucharist. And it was funny when I read the write-up. I thought, I wrote about around 11 or 1,200 saints. Okay, when I was writing for Magnificat, and some of them repeatedly, so I spent a lot of time with their stories. And so when I'm asked to give a talk like this, I kind of like, who's going to come forward? Who's going to show their face and say that I'm the person that needs to, you need to talk about? And the three that I ended up going with, none of them none of them lived on the Eucharist, or like St. Clare, this great story about St. Clare that she repelled the invaders coming to enter her monastery with the Eucharist, with the monstrance held up. None of these saints have a story like that. And actually, I got thinking about it, I thought how beautiful that is, because I love the miracle stories, but also the thing that most moves me about the saints is their humanity and the way that I can see something of myself in their life. And then in their lives, I start to get a taste or a sense of like where I could be going, like where's the next place I could go with my faith. So I was thinking that this is it's a beautiful thing that these people presented themselves. So tonight, I'm going to talk about three figures: a man, a woman, and a teenage boy. They're from 3 different centuries, and they lived in 3 different parts of the globe. One was born a Protestant and converted to Catholicism. One was raised Catholic and then, had a kind of wild and crazy youth and then came back. And then one was baptized into a Christian or Catholic family that did not practice, was Catholic in name, but did not go to church and did not practice the faith. So I think I feel like there's something there in each one of them that maybe we can kind of tap into or relate to. All three of them, though, found their power and their strength in the Eucharist. For all three of these people, Elizabeth, Carlo, and Charles, day by day, more and more, Jesus became the most important thing in their lives. The center of life was Jesus present, body and blood, soul and divinity in the Eucharist. So we have three figures, three stories, and all about one amazing thing, the Eucharist. So the first person I want to talk about is St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, who happens to be my patron saint. And I have the huge blessing in my life right now that I write a monthly column for the Elizabeth Ann Seton Shrine. So I am supposed to write about a saint and then relate them to Elizabeth Ann Seton. So I've been able to go back into Elizabeth Ann Seton's life many times over the last few years. And when I was a child in Catholic school, we always, I was still going to Catholic school when there were still nuns teaching. I mean, there's still some nuns out there teaching, but there were more at the time. And they would make us memorize certain things about the Catholic Church. And one of the things that we had to memorize was that Elizabeth Ann Seton was the first American-born canonized saint. And so I knew that about her. But in the last few years, I've been able to learn so much more. And what I'm going to talk about now is the amazing experience that she had in her life related to the Eucharist. So Elizabeth Ann Seton was born Elizabeth Bailey in 1774 in New Rochelle, New York. So she was a New Yorker. Her mom died when she was only 3, and her father got remarried. She had a stepmother and 5 step-siblings, and actually later in life, her father and stepmother separated. So there was a kind of a brokenness in the beginning of her life, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But she was a beautiful woman, young woman, in her teenage years, actually physically beautiful, but also beautiful in soul. At 19, Elizabeth married William Seton, who was a merchant, and she moved into a lovely house on Wall Street in New York City. Together they had 5 children. And they had a very, very happy marriage. In fact, Elizabeth was just a woman who was truly happy to be a mom and a wife. Now, when their youngest child, around the time that their youngest child was born, William, Elizabeth's husband, started to get sick. And it was all the signs were there that he had tuberculosis, which of course is a very serious and ultimately fatal disease, but it can take many, many years to play out. And at the time, he was also struggling in his business dealings, so there was a lot of stress in his life. Elizabeth and William had some friends, or they were actually William's friends, Antonio and Filippo Felici. And these were Italian merchants. They lived in Leghorn, Italy. So they were business partners or business associates of William's. And they invited William to come to Italy for a while with the idea that if he got to sunny Italy and had some downtime and some rest, he could recover from the bout of illness that he was struggling with at the time. Elizabeth was super concerned for her husband, and she decided to go with him on this trip. And they brought their daughter, the oldest daughter, Anna, and they had to leave the other 4 children with family members. So they got on the boat to go to Italy, and after, over a month-long sea journey, which was very challenging for William because he was already quite ill, they arrived in Italy, in Leghorn, Italy, and unbeknownst to them, at that time, in that town, there was a yellow fever pandemic. So we all know about pandemics now, right? They got into the harbor. Elizabeth was excited because William had been really ill on the journey, and she was thinking, we've just got to get him to a place where he's going to get better. And they were informed by the Italian authorities that they were going to have to go into quarantine. The authorities refused to let them actually go into the town until they had spent 30 days in the Lazaretto, which was a quarantine station. Now, the Lazaretto was an old stone building, and it was cold, it was unheated, It was drafty. It was a very unpleasant place for a person who was very seriously ill to be staying. Nevertheless, Elizabeth and William and Anna had to go into the lazaretto. Now, this was a turning point in Elizabeth's life, because William went into the lazaretto a very sick man, but he came out a dying man. There was very little that Elizabeth could do for her husband in this 30 days, except watch him suffer, nurse him the best she could, feed him and comfort him, but there was no access to medical care. It was freezing, the food wasn't great, and she was, obviously she was just his wife. She couldn't do really too much for him. Nevertheless, she stayed by him and would talk to him, pray with him, and be really close to him. And in the moments when he would kind of fall out of that feverish agony he was in, into sleep, into a fitful sleep, Elizabeth would fall herself into prayer. Elizabeth Ann Seton was a woman of prayer. She was deeply spiritual. And in fact, she later said that as difficult as this time was, and it was just awful, like they had a fire, and she would light the fire, and the chimney didn't work right, so smoke would blow into the room. It was just as bad as you could imagine. But as awful as it all was, she said that it ended up being like a retreat for her, because when things did quiet down, she always went into prayer. Elizabeth was a woman of great faith. God's holy will was her mantra, and she prayed these words in the lazaretto as few women have, with love and abandonment to her heavenly Father. And even before all three of them were released from the lazaretto, word had got round about this. People, the Italian soldiers who were guarding them and keeping them in the quarantine, started going into town and talking about this amazing woman, what a beautiful, heroic wife she was, and how beautifully she attended to her husband. So there was kind of a buzz going on in Leghorn, Italy, about Elizabeth Ann Seton. And what were they saying? They were saying, that woman, she could be a saint, if only she weren't a heretic. Because Elizabeth Ann Seton was not Catholic. She was a Protestant. She was Episcopalian. Everybody in that Italian town, they were all Catholics, right? And here was this Protestant woman who had come among them. They knew that she didn't follow the Pope. They knew that she didn't pray to the saints or Mary. And they knew that she didn't believe that the Eucharist was the body and blood of Jesus Christ, right? These were three things that separated Catholics from Protestants. So that was the word that was going out on the street at the time. Now, when they got out of the lazaretto after 30 days, there were only 10 more days that William had in existence in life. He was so seriously ill when they got out. But they were fortunate enough that they were able to go to the house of his friends, right? Antonio and his wife Amabilia they were well off, they had a beautiful home, and they let William and they welcomed them into their home. And like I said, very soon after that, William died. Elizabeth attended him to the end. Afterwards, she was overcome with grief. And since she had no other mourning clothes, she donned the black dress and cape of an Italian widow, essentially the Italian mourning garb. And as you can see from the picture up there, and the picture you have in front of you, that's what she's wearing in that picture, that classic picture. That's essentially an Italian widow's mourning garb. She buried her husband, and then she set about getting to know the Felicis, who were her new friends, and who in their kindness had offered Elizabeth and her daughter the chance to stay as long as they needed to until they could arrange passage to return to America. As it happened, because of different circumstances, it was a few months before Elizabeth and Anna could go back to America, so she stayed with the Felicis for that entire time. And in that time, a dramatic change happened in her life. Now, the Felicis were a wonderful family. They were faithful, gentle, and intelligent, and they really knew their Catholic faith. they saw that Elizabeth had a lot going for her. They could see that she was a very unusual woman. But they also just wanted to share with her what they loved, right? They were good friends. And so they took, and of course she was mourning, so they wanted to cheer her up, right? They wanted to make her feel better. So they started taking her on little trips, and they would go, we went into Florence. So, Florence, right, guys? This is an American in Italy. You can imagine, it's the same experience any of us would have going to Italy now. You're just blown away by the churches and the museums and everything that's old and beautiful there. So they started taking Elizabeth to different things, different places there. And of course, a big part of that in Italy is visiting the churches. And Elizabeth, in this time, we know about what was going on in her life because she wrote a lot of letters home to her sister-in-law and to her friend. And so we have those letters, and she described her experience the first time she went into one of these churches where the Blessed Sacrament was being displayed in a monstrance, and what a shock it was to her, because she said all over the church there were people, young, old, rich, poor, but all of them praying, all of them in their own space with Jesus. And this really struck her. She'd never seen anything like this in a church, this attention to this host, right? Host in the monstrance on the altar. This really struck her. Another time, they took her to a mass. Now, this was a big thing, and you have to think this was such a silent, reverent mass that she went to. People were, there was the sense of solemnity and silence was intense in the mass, and she's in the mass as a spectator, right? She doesn't think that this is the body and blood of Jesus that is being consecrated on the altar, but she's following along, right? She's standing when they stand and kneeling when they kneel. And in the middle of the mass, of course, comes this very solemn moment when the consecration happens, right? When the host is raised on high and becomes the body of Christ. And next to Elizabeth in the Mass was another visitor, another Protestant man. And in this moment, which was most silent and most solemn, in that moment, this man leaned over and whispered very loudly into Elizabeth's ear, "This is what they call the real presence." It was so shocking and jarring to her, and she knew everybody had heard it, right? It was a loud enough whisper that everybody could hear it through the whole church. And she said she just looked down in just complete paralysis. Because in this moment, she realized, she was looking on and something in her was starting to get it. This is Jesus. And that man's kind of irreverent, like almost angry whisper jarred her because she thought, this is not right. This is not right. This is a moment where we have to pay attention. So that happened too. And things are starting to happen inside Elizabeth. She started realizing that the Mass, the Eucharist, was the center point for her hosts. Amabilia and Antonio were among the Catholics that went to Mass every day. They were daily communicants. And when she started kind of processing this and realizing that they went off every morning and they were receiving the Eucharist, which they believed to be the body of Jesus Christ, it was almost too much for her. All her life, Elizabeth had been a praying woman, a devout Protestant. God had entered her life in a big way from her childhood. She was, like I said, she prayed. She served the poor. She had a great devotion to taking care of poor widows and orphans. She did a lot of charitable work. She taught her children the prayers. And of course, she went to the Episcopal services. But she never felt in that time that she got enough of Jesus. She got enough of the Lord. When she prayed, she felt like she was praying kind of up into the sky to a God that's up there, far away. Her prayers kind of had to wing their way up to the Lord. When she went to church, she always wanted more. In fact, the Episcopalians had communion services once a week on Sundays, and there were no weekday communion services. So the one time you had communion was Sunday. And in fact, that communion, they believed communion was a sign of Jesus' presence, but it wasn't really Jesus. Nevertheless, that made, or maybe because of that, that made Elizabeth so hungry for the Lord. And she used to, when she was an Episcopalian, she would go from church to church in the city and see how many services she could get to on Sunday, because she wanted to have as much of it as she could. So she just wanted more of the Lord, right? But, when she saw what the Italians had, she was shocked. They could see Jesus, they could touch him, and they could taste him. They could receive him every day if they wanted. Even when they were sick, someone would bring Jesus to them. She said, and these were her words, they possess God in this sacrament. And Elizabeth wanted this for herself. Now, this all leads up to kind of a dramatic moment one day when she's at the Felici home. There happens to be, and this happens on a pretty regular basis at this time in Italy, a Eucharistic procession going by in the street, okay? And she'd seen this before, but this particular day it was going past her window, and she said, as it passed her window, she was so overcome by the sense of God's presence in the Eucharist, and she threw herself down on the ground. Later, she wrote to her sister-in-law. She said, I felt the loneliness of my case. I couldn't stop tears at the thought, my God, how happy would I be, even so far away from all so dear, if I could find you in the church as they do. How many things I would say to you of the sorrows of my heart and the sins of my life. As the Blessed Sacrament passed by, I cried in agony to God to bless me, if he was there, that my whole soul desired only him. Now, it's so interesting because at this moment, as she's tortured by this thought, and she's thrown herself down on the ground, she reaches up onto the table there in her room and pulls down a prayer book that, of course, her Catholic friends had left in the room, right? And she opens it up and she gets to a prayer that was written by St. Bernard, of course, is our patron at St. Bernard's School of Theology. And St. Bernard had a great devotion to the Blessed Mother. And she opened this up and read this prayer that St. Bernard had written to Mary. Now, another interesting thing had been happening. She'd had a thing going on with Mary, too. She was seeing images of Mary and starting to feel this desire to pray to Mary. So she did. She prayed this prayer to Mary. And she said, in this moment, she just laid all of her sorrow and her desire to have Jesus in Mary's hands and asked Mary to console her. I cried myself to sleep on her heart, she said, that night. Well, if you're a Protestant woman and you're praying to Mary about the Eucharist, I think you're toast, if I can put it that way. She was done for, right? She was just being tortured by this desire to have this faith that they had, that the Italians had. Now, not long after this event, where she threw herself down on the ground, Elizabeth paid her final respects at her husband's grave, and she embarked for America. But obviously something was happening in her heart. She was accompanied by her friend Antonio, who gallantly agreed to go with her and travel in a time when, of course, it wasn't terrifically safe for a young, beautiful woman who doesn't have a husband now, to travel alone with a child. So she went back to New York. And the whole journey was a conversation with Antonio about this new faith that was budding inside of her. When Elizabeth reached New York, she found herself already kind of on the cusp of wanting to move in the direction of becoming a Catholic. But of course, she had to share it with her Protestant friends. She also had a Protestant spiritual director. She was very close to one of the preachers there, the Episcopalian preachers there in the city. And as soon as her friends and family found out and realized what was happening to her, of course, they pleaded and argued with her. The battle over Elizabeth raged for months, with her writing back and forth to her Protestant friends and family and her new Catholic friends. And she was torn because, of course, the Episcopalian faith represented her whole world that she knew at the time, her friends, her family, everything she had come from. And even though she was feeling herself very much drawn by Catholicism, in order to keep up appearances, she would continue going at times when she felt she had to the Episcopalian services. And she wrote at that time to her Catholic friend how one day she went into the church and sat in a side pew in the Episcopal Church with her face turned toward the Catholic Church in the next street. So she's looking out the window at the Catholic Church in the next street. And she said, I found myself 20 times speaking to the Blessed Sacrament there instead of looking at the naked altar where I was. At long last, after about a year, Elizabeth finally came into the church. It was a really dramatic moment for her because it meant leaving behind that world that she knew. Her family would not support her. Most of her friends did not support her, and she lost some friends over this. She also lost a lot of support, financial support from her family, and of course she was a widow, so that was pretty dramatic. Now, rather than attending services with the New York elite, because all of the well-to-do people were Episcopalians, she would be going to Mass with the scrubby immigrants, this scrubby Irish immigrants that attended St. Peter's Church on Barclay Street, which was the only Catholic church in New York City at the time. But this was nothing compared to what she had gained. She had the Lord. These are Elizabeth's words of joy on the day she was able to finally receive her first communion. She wrote to her friend Amabilia, Antonio's wife, in Italy. Amabilia, at last, God is mine and I am his. Now, let all go its round. I've received him. To the last breath of life will I not remember this day. The long walk to town. Every step counted. Nearer that street, then nearer that tabernacle, then nearer the moment he would enter. And when he did, the first thought I remember was, let God arise. Let his enemies be scattered. For it seemed to me that my king had come to take his throne. It was the triumph of joy and gladness that the deliverer was come, and my defense and shield and strength and salvation made mine for this world and the next. Her 5 children came into the church at the same time, and a year later, Elizabeth was confirmed by the only bishop in the whole United States at the time, John Carroll. She confided to Bishop Carroll at that time her desire to give her whole life to the church, and he was instrumental in what happened next, which was that she became religious. She became a religious nun. Despite all the difficulties, she did have 5 children after all. She became the foundress of the first women's religious congregation founded on American soil. They were educators and set about founding a school in Baltimore and then near Mount St. Mary's, the first seminary in America. The congregation took the rule of the Sisters of Charity, founded by St. Vincent de Paul and St. Louise de Marillac. Now, Elizabeth's 3 daughters came with her into the convent, and her sons went to a Catholic boarding school. Eventually, 2 of her daughters would die of tuberculosis in the convent with her, and that is actually what took Elizabeth's own life. Elizabeth died at the, I think, very young age of 46, which is amazing when you think the role that she played in our history, how short her life was. And her deathbed scene testifies to the amazing strength she drew from the Eucharist from that moment of her first communion all the way to the end of her life. She insisted at the very end of her life that she be permitted to fast to receive the Eucharist, and they were coming in trying to give her medicine, and she would push it away and say, no, I just want communion. I just want communion. Well, we all know that one of the ways that we refer to those final communions that a person receive is viaticum, that word viaticum, which means provisions for the journey. So what she was really doing was seeking provisions for that journey into the next life, into eternal life. And that's actually what she got. Elizabeth died in a most beautiful way. The last words that she spoke to the religious sisters who gathered around her were, "Be children of the church, children of the church." Now, what can we draw from Elizabeth Ann Seton life about our life with God, about our relationship to the Eucharist? And I'm going to do this for each one of these 3 saints. Just try to draw a little bit of a lesson from their life. And what I get the most what I get from Elizabeth the most here is an attitude, a kind of approach to God that I think is really helpful in our lives. Elizabeth wasn't afraid to bring what she most wanted to God. She wasn't, and when you think about it, they're really earthly desires. Like we come to Mass, and maybe we come before the Lord in the Eucharist, and we feel like we have to be asking for spiritual goods, right? Like, make me courageous, make me pray a better, prayer, make me, when we name all these virtues, right? Make me more patient, make me more kind, make me more loving, which are great. I'm not saying those are bad prayers. But Elizabeth was like, fill me up. I desire you, Jesus. I want to eat you. I want to taste you. I want you in my life every single day. She had the boldness to ask God for a mother. She said, and she admitted, I lost my mother at a young age. I had a stepmother that I lost. I had felt an enormous hole, gaping hole in the middle of my life, and I asked God to fill that hole. So she had no problem coming before the Lord and saying, give me these really concrete things. And let me tell you, this is the way the saints are. They are not afraid to ask God for exactly what they want. I want to be filled up. I want spirit. I want food. I want to taste something. I want to feel something. I want to have a spouse. I want to have a mother. I want to have a father. These are the kinds of prayers that the saints teach us to pray. And Elizabeth's prayers were all answered by the Lord. He sustained her. And this is a beautiful lesson, I think, that we can take into our own prayer, right? To ask him for what we really want. Okay, so that was Elizabeth. Let's move on here. You can look at the next picture now if you want. We can go to the next slide. Carlo Acutis. So we're going to go from the 18th century, 18th, 19th century to the 21st century. Carlo Acutis. Our next saint began and ended his journey, he began his journey in 2006 and he died in 2006. He died in the 21st century, and he is our first millennial. He died at the age of 15 and a half in Milan, Italy. Carlo Acutis. Since that time, he's already blessed Carlo Acutis, which is amazing. That means that he is most of the way towards becoming a saint. His life has been examined for evidence of holiness. There are many people publicly venerating him. You can go to his tomb in Assisi, Italy, and venerate his body. And there's already one miracle that has been confirmed that was through his intercession. A miracle means that science cannot explain what happened. We only need one more miracle, and then he will be declared a saint. Carlo was the only child of a wealthy family. He was a single child. And although his parents had him baptized, they did not go to Mass. In fact, his mother said in an interview I heard that she said, really, before Carlo's baptism, the only other times I was in a church was for my own baptism and my wedding. Her baptism, her first communion, and her wedding. So she'd done those three things. But from the time that Carlo was a little boy, now he's a little Italian boy, so he's got lots of churches around him, he began to ask his parents and his caretakers, because he was very wealthy and they had domestic servants, to take him to Mass. He wanted to go to church. When he was only 6, he approached the priest at church and asked for his first Holy Communion. Now, think about this. Most of us bring our kids to those classes, right? You got to schlep them there in the car. This was a kid who decided on his own at 6, now I want Holy Communion. And he went and asked the priest. So this priest recognized that something really special was happening in this kid, and he made a special request. He said, okay, I'll give you first Holy Communion, but I want you to come and have your first communion in this convent where there are cloistered nuns in silence. So you can imagine a little boy all by himself. And Carlo Acutis got himself a little white I guess he got his parents to get himself a little white gown to wear that day. And he went to this convent where the nuns were behind the grill. Okay, so like if you go to the Carmelite monastery here, you can see the same setup, right? There's a grill. So they can kind of see you, but you can't really see them. But the nuns told afterwards that they saw Carlo come in very serious, very attentive, and was quiet the whole Mass until it got really close to that point when he was going to receive communion. And then he got really like a little kid, like he was really anxious to receive. He went up, he received his Lord for the first time, went back to his seat, put his head down, quiet. And then they said he started squirming around like a new life had begun in him. That's what the nuns said. And in fact, a new life had begun in Carlo Acutis. After this time, this little boy who was 7 at the time, he had tried to go to Mass every single day of his life. Little boy. It was a source of his strength, and when he couldn't make it to Mass, he always made a spiritual communion. We can say that what filled Carlo Acutis up, what caused the joy and peace that were very characteristic of him, and you can see this, there's tons of pictures of him. He's a millennial. We have tons of pictures of this kid, right? You can see that he has that joy that just radiates. What filled him up and caused his joy and peace and his compassion for others was really the bread of life. The Eucharist fed him. The Eucharist is my highway to heaven, he said. At 11, this young boy became an assistant catechist at his parish. Okay, so he's trying to go to Mass every day. He's asking people to take him to Mass. And he became an assistant catechist at the age of 11. When he died at 15 and a half, he knew most of the catechism of the Catholic Church by heart. I cannot tell you that I know most of the catechism of the Catholic Church by heart, and I'm a Catholic theologian. It's astounding when you think about it. Yet, this kid was also super ordinary, and this is what's really amazing. He enjoyed all the things that boys loved. He had a few dogs that he loved. He played soccer. He made videos with his video camera. A lot of the pictures you can see, he's got his video camera. Like, he's a really modern kid. He loved gaming. He played Pokemon and all the different games that the kids were playing at that time. Yet, his passion for the Eucharist that was planted in his heart. It really seemed like it was planted, from heaven in his heart, really grounded him. In addition to receiving the Eucharist daily, he spent time in Eucharistic adoration before and after Mass. And I love this part about him because, a lot of times we think adoration, I've got to make an hour and make a special trip. But he was like, no, I'll stay for 15 minutes after Mass and spend a little more time with our Lord. So it's very simple, silent prayer. He compared this to going out to the sun and getting a suntan. He said, when we go into the sun, we get a suntan. When we get in front of Jesus, we become saints. Carlo's advice for what to do when we have some time to spend with Jesus in prayer was very simple. He said, I like to speak to Jesus about all that I am living and feeling. He said, to him, I can always confide something. I can also complain, question him about his silence, and tell him what I do not understand. And then, within me, I find a word that he sends me, a moment of the gospel that fills me with conviction and certainty. Carlo also said, sadness is the gaze turned toward oneself. Happiness is the gaze turned towards God. Conversion is nothing other than lifting our eyes, our gaze from low to high. Just a simple movement of the eyes. I've been meditating on this quote for the last week because every time I feel a little down, I'm like, no, look up, look up. The time spent with Jesus enabled Carlo to become surely and gradually transformed. Virtues, he said, are acquired mainly through intense sacramental life, and the Eucharist is certainly its apex. Through this sacrament, the Lord makes us whole in his image. Now, as you may imagine, the adults in Carlo's life were really in wonder at him. I heard an interview with his mother, and she talks about how Carlo was kind of like a father to her. Now, she wasn't an immature woman, but she didn't have a spiritual upbringing. And here is this child, her own child, and to her credit, she paid attention and she listened to him. Her own child teaching her about God. Now, one of the things that he convinced his parents to do was take him on vacation to spots where there were Eucharistic miracles. He kind of conned them into this. He also talked them into spending summers in Assisi, Italy. So wealthy Italians go off for the summer and find a great place to go. They don't, mostly they don't go to places like Assisi, which are kind of tourist traps, right? But he wanted to be where St. Francis was. St. Francis was his favorite saint, and he spent his summers in Assisi, and that's where Carlo Acutis' shrine is now. Another person in his life was Rajesh, the Indian domestic servant in his home. Carlo talked to Rajesh all about the faith, and Rajesh decided he wanted to be baptized. Like Carlo, he developed a love for the Eucharist, and he looked forward with great excitement to his first communion. And then, when he received his confirmation, it was exactly as Carlo told it would be. Carlo told Rajesh, when I received confirmation, I received a special power inside of me to love the Eucharist even more. And that's what happened to Rajesh, he says. So it's beautiful how he was bringing adults to the Eucharist. Now, Carlo was a very smart boy, and he was very into gaming, and he had a fascination and a talent for coding. In fact, he was extremely, I would say, brilliant when it comes to coding. He decided to build his own website, and you can go and see that online right now. It's called Miracoli Eucharistici.org. So that's an Italian name, but there is an English translation there. And it was devoted to sharing the truth about Eucharistic miracles. His favorite miracle was the miracle that had occurred in Lanciano, Italy, around the year 730. That year, the village priest had been struggling to believe that what Jesus says is true, that his flesh is true food and his blood true drink. The priest begged the Lord to come to his aid, and one day, while he was saying Mass, the host and the wine changed into real flesh and real blood. And that's a picture of the flesh and the blood. That's in a reliquary in Lanciano, Italy. And in fact, this was all, you can find this all on Carlo's website, because he researched all of these miracles and put all the information on his website. In 1970, this flesh that's in this picture was analyzed, and it turns out to be myocardial or heart tissue. And the blood, which appears fresh, belonged to the AB group. So it is human flesh and human blood. These were the kinds of things that moved Carlo, because they helped confirm for him what he already knew in his heart to be true, that this Jesus was present. Body and blood were present in the Eucharist. Now, obviously, I've already told you that Carlo died at 15 and a half. So obviously, there's kind of a tragedy there, but it's not nearly as tragic. I don't think it's as tragic as you would imagine it to be, because he died in a very beautiful way. When he was 15 and a half, Carlo got sick, and at first his parents thought it was the flu. And within a week, he got much sicker, and they took him to the hospital, and it turned out that he had a fatal form of leukemia that attacks the blood cells, and it kills you very quickly. He was dead, I think, within the next week. It might be 10 days, but he died very quickly. Of course, that's quite a dramatic thing to tell a 15-year-old that you're going to be dead in a week, right? But Carlo had really been prepared for this his entire life. And he said, I don't regret anything because I haven't wasted a single minute of my short life. He offered his suffering up for the Pope and the Church. He said, and this is a quote from his last days. And you can read, if you go online, you can read the list of quotes, things that he said in his final days. He said, Golgotha, of course referring to the place where Jesus died, is for everyone. No one escapes the cross. He also said, our goal must be infinite, not finite. The infinite is our homeland. Heaven has been waiting for us forever. When Carlo died and they had the funeral, a lot of people showed up at this funeral that his parents didn't even know. It turned out that Carlo was an incredibly generous person, as young as he was. He befriended the poor and the homeless people he would see on his walks to school and his walks to Mass. He would meet them with a smile. He would bring them money. He would bring them food. And a lot of people were touched by him. But where did all of this come from? The center of his life was what God was doing inside of him. God was just loving, this is the way I wrote it, God was loving this kid like crazy. And this kid was just drinking it all in. And then he was letting that love radiate to other people. So, what can we learn from Carlo? This is what I draw from his life. What Carlo was always saying, and the church in fact teaches, that it is primarily through the life of the sacraments that our lives become transformed. It is through the Eucharist. It is through confession. Carlo went to confession once a week. It is through these means, if we use them, if we avail ourselves of what the church has for us, that our lives start to really change. That we actually become more virtuous. Like all those things I was saying, you want to go and pray for. I want to be more loving. I want to be more patient. This is how we get those things, is through the Eucharist, through confession, through these gifts that God has given us. Now, in my experience talking about the saints for some years now, and also, I guess, reflecting on my own prejudices that I had when I went into writing about the saints, I realized that a lot of people come in and think saints are people that are just really trying really hard. They're really moral giants, and they're always kind of exerting their will to do better and do more. And what Carlo was exerting his will to do was be close to Jesus. And he said Jesus transformed him. And that was what opened his hearts to others. So his witness startlingly simple. Conversion is a simple movement of the eyes. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. Look up. All right, that was Carlo. Let's move on to Charles de Foucauld, St. Charles de Foucauld, the third person in our story. Charles is also a very new saint. He was canonized in 2022 by Pope Francis, but he's been a favorite of mine for some time. He was born in, so here's our different century. He was born in the 1800s in Strasbourg, France, to a devout Catholic family. But, like Elizabeth, he had early losses. In fact, both of his parents died when he was 6 years old. He had a loving grandparents, though, and his grandfather, who was a colonel in the army, took in Charles and his sister Marie. His grandfather shared a passion that he had for geography and history. This is a man who had, he was in the military his whole life, and he learned a lot in that time. And he shared all of that with Charles. But he also spoiled Charles. He indulged him a lot. And when Charles would get angry or frustrated, the way his grandfather would deal with that was just kind of giving him more. They were a wealthy family. So by the time he was in his teens, Charles had decided that he really no longer needed God. He was really a spoiled kid. And he also says years later that in his teen years, he really didn't meet anybody that could answer the questions he had and kind of guide him in his life. He said there's a lot of questions that young people have, and they need someone to give them good answers. And he didn't have anybody like that. So he got into partying. You know what do teenagers do? He did what a rich French boy will do, right? He got into partying. At 18, when he finished school and he finished high school, his grandfather convinced him to go into the military because for his grandfather, that was the best thing to do, right? And he sent him to military school. And when Charles showed up at military school, he was overweight. They couldn't even find a uniform to fit him. He was that overweight. They called him Piggy. That was his nickname in the military school. And, you know, he had to struggle to do all of those things you have to do, those exercises. He graduated in 2 years at the bottom of his class. He didn't try very hard. He kept his partying up. And then he was sent to he was able to get into, I'm sure through his grandfather's intercession, he was able to get into the cavalry school. So you learn to ride and use the saber and all the stuff that you would have learned in the 1800s in military school like that. And he kept up all his bad habits. He, in fact, not long after he went to this second school, his grandfather died, and Charles inherited a lot of money. So now he had all the money to indulge all his habits, and he would have parties with like truffles and caviar and champagne, and he had a lot of women, and he would joke that he rented women by the day. He would never lease them. So he obviously had a thing going with women. And in this school, he also graduated at the bottom of his class. He kind of barely made it through. After 2 years in the cavalry school, these young military recruits were sent to Algeria. So if you can imagine, at this time, France had a lot of colonies in North Africa, and these young men were being sent because there were things that the military was doing in Algeria. There was kind of an uprising that they were putting down, and he was sent on assignment as well. And when he showed up in Algeria, he had a woman with him that he told everybody was his wife, but in fact she was his mistress. Well, not long after he got there, his superiors discovered that this was his mistress, and at that time, this was a big no-no in the military. It undermined the military discipline, and so he was basically suspended. He was basically kicked out and said, "You have to leave because you've lied to us and you brought this woman that you're not married to." So the woman went home, of course, and Charles was hanging out there in Algeria, and he saw that his classmates were really getting to really do what they were trained for, and something in him he kind of manned up, right? He's like, "I think I'll stay. I think I'll try to get back in." He got into the military, and he served with some distinction at that time for a few months. And in that time, being in North Africa, a change started happening in him. And this is the first shift in his life, because like I said, he was quite a partier. I mean, he was way worse than St. Augustine. We often talk about Augustine as being, the convert, the partier who became a Catholic saint, but Charles de Foucauld was actually way worse than Augustine. Augustine was very faithful to one woman he had a concubine, but he had her the whole time, and Charles was a womanizer. But at this point, he's gone back into the army, and one of the things he's starting to notice is the beauty of North Africa. He was in a place that had a lot of physical beauty, dramatic beauty. And he kind of started falling for this place. It was exotic. There were tribesmen. There were Muslims. It wasn't France. And he found himself really attracted to this life. And at this time, while he's still in the military, an opportunity emerged for him. There were a lot of people Europeans starting to enter into places in Africa that no Europeans had ever gone, and they were doing exploration. And so there were these opportunities that were coming open, especially for young men of means, which he was, to actually go on an expedition and go and do something with your time, something that was cool, adventurous, and exciting. He decided he was going to do this. He left the army and started on an exploration through Morocco. He obtained all these instruments. He was going to do surveys. He was going to examine the plants and animals and the people and write everything up and, basically being an explorer. And so in order to do this, he had to come up with a disguise because it wasn't terrifically safe for a young, rich Frenchman to just go through Morocco at this time without having a reason to be there, okay? So this is the first thing that happens. He decides he's going to pose as a Jewish rabbi. Okay, so here's a guy who's completely left behind his faith. Okay, at this point, he doesn't believe in God anymore. He's faithless. He's been living a really wild life, and he's going to pose as a Jewish rabbi. And he has a companion who's going to be his guide, who was a Moroccan Jew. So the idea of posing as a rabbi was this idea that he was going to be with this Moroccan Jew who could speak the language and get him everywhere. And he was just a visiting rabbi, right? So he donned the garb of a rabbi, and he wore it for the entire 11 months he was there. In addition to this kind of experience of Judaism, because he was with a devout Jew, and he started meeting other Jews because he was a rabbi. I don't know how he worked this out. This part I don't understand. But he was meeting a lot of Muslims, the Arab Muslims, and also the tribesmen, because the Arabs had come in, had been converting the tribesmen in that area. And the Muslims were very devout, and he saw these kind of masculine images of religiosity, right? Men that were really serious about their faith. And this was very attractive to him in this time. The other thing that happened was, because he wasn't on an expedition, there were no women, and he had to eat very sparsely, right? Because you're traveling, you have to carry everything with you. So he kind of had to go on a fast from women, and he had to go on a fast from all that indulgent food he'd been eating. So he actually slowly but surely was becoming chaste and temperate, not in a religious way, but by necessity, right? He had to. He was traveling through, and he had to do it in order to do what he wanted, which was this kind of adventure. So at the end of the 11 months, he gets done. He's done a lot of scientific observation. He was actually quite good at this, and he goes back to France, and he writes a book. It's a book about his explorations, and it was actually very well accepted by the scientific community. It was kind of a mini classic, because he was very good at what he did. So he's back in France, and he's written the book, and now he's decided to go back and visit his family in Strasbourg. And things are starting to change for him. He's cleaned himself up a little bit, or I guess life is cleaning himself up. His edges are being worn away here. And his family is still quite concerned, because I think I mentioned at the beginning, he came from a devout Catholic family, and he's still got a lot of extended family, and they know that he's been living a kind of wild life, and he's not very faithful. So when he comes back to visit them, they start kind of arranging these little soirees where he's going to meet, some Catholics, some cool Catholics, right? Like what you'd try to do for your 24-year-old, cousin or nephew. And he starts going to these different events. And two people start to become figures for him. One of them is his cousin, and he hasn't seen since he's 11 years old, and her name was Marie. And Marie is a beautiful woman. Okay, she is his cousin, so he's not interested in her romantically, but of course he was into beautiful women. She's a beautiful woman, and she's very smart. She's a very smart Catholic, and she has no interest in evangelizing him. She just wants to kind of hang out with him and love him, like be his cousin. So he's in the company of this beautiful woman who has a beautiful, very rich intellectual faith, so she knows what she's about, and that really starts to affect him, because he had at one point decided, there's nothing to Catholicism. Actually, there was a point when he was in Morocco where he actually kind of toyed with the idea of becoming Muslim, because he was attracted to these figures. So, in that time, he's thinking, the Catholic faith, there's nothing to it. But now he meets this young woman, he's like, there's got to be something to this Catholic faith. That was one thing. That was one person he met, was this cousin, and she was a beautiful figure to him. The second person was a priest. His name was Father Uvelin. And Father Uvelin was a kind of I don't want to say celebrity, because that would not be the right word, but he was a very well-known spiritual director, and a lot of people went to him for advice. And Father Uvelin was very smart too, and there was a lot to him. He was very full personality. And so these are two people that he's meeting in this time. And what happens is, all of a sudden things start shifting inside of him. And he starts thinking, what? Maybe there really is something to the faith I was actually baptized into. Maybe there was something to this Catholic faith. And he starts going to church, and he starts praying. he starts asking God, can you just like give me faith? Like prove yourself. I want to see you. Can I know somehow? Because he doesn't feel that inside of him. Now, it might be good to pause here for a minute and think about what's going on in Charles's life, because I think it's really interesting what has happened to him. He's gotten some good religious role models. They're Muslims and Jews, but they're good religious role models. They show him that you can be a man and you can be faithful. You can have a faith, right? He's gotten kind of through his circumstances, chastity and temperance, like not by the way of like, I'm going to become chaste, I'm going to become temperate, but that's kind of what's happened to him because of life. He's met a beautiful woman, right, who is beautiful inside and out, and he's met a really powerful spiritual figure, a spiritual father. And I think these are all very interesting things that we think about. What does it mean to kind of come to Christ, come to the church? These are all pieces that, you can kind of keep in your mind when you're thinking about like, what do I need in my life? I need spiritual fathers and mothers. I need friends. I need role models, and I need to have kind of some basic virtue, which is all stuff that I think that's also what life can give us if we work hard, if we kind of do our duty in life. Because once he started being a dutiful human being and having a job and doing real stuff, he started, kind of losing that weight and paying attention to the things that were important. So all of this is happening. But the thing he doesn't have at this point is faith, right? He's going and he's praying on his knees for hours and begging God, like, if you're there, let me know you. But he doesn't feel like he has faith. So finally one day, desperation, and this is all happening over just a few month period, he decides he's going to go talk to this priest that he's been meeting at the soirees and the parties, Father Uvelan, and he goes to the confessional, okay? And he goes into the confessional and he kneels down and he says, Father, I do not have faith. Please teach me. Can you teach me the faith? And the priest looks at him and says, kneel down and confess your sins. And Charles is like, no, wait. I didn't come here to confess. I came here. I want you to tell me how I can have faith. And the priest says, just confess your sins. Okay, so what does he do? He goes to confession. Now, it's a pretty long confession, as you can imagine. It's like a general confession, right? But he confesses his sins. And at the end, the priest says, have you been fasting? Like, have you been eating? Like he wants to know if he's eaten that day. And Charles says, I've been fasting. I haven't been eating. And the priest says, go to communion. Just go to communion. And that's what Charles does. He goes to communion. He's in the church, he goes to mass, goes to communion. And in that moment, faith came back. He was kneeling down and he was just hit with it, that God did exist and he did love him. It was just open up for him. Now, this shouldn't really be surprising for us, right? I mean, it's not a miracle in a way, because this is what we learn through our Catholic faith. When we are baptized, we receive the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, right? And they're there, but they have to be developed, right? We have to respond to that grace in some way, but they're there. But if we fall into what we call mortal sin, right? If we block that connection with God, then that grace can't be working that we receive at our baptism. So what happened was really, really basic. It was basic. He went to confession. He confessed his sins. The blockage was removed. He went to communion, and Jesus was there for him right away, right? But then another thing happens, and this is a really amazing thing and an amazing grace in the life of Charles de Foucauld. He, in this moment, was suddenly hit with this thought, or this realization. God exists, and I'm going to serve him for the rest of my life, with my whole life. Like, he received in this moment not just faith, but a total vocation to dedicate himself entirely to God. And this was quite dramatic. And just very soon after this, he made a decision. He'd been talking to Father Uvelan, and he'd been so moved by the fact that Father Uvelan was always talking about the littleness of Christ, like how Jesus always took the lowest place. He came to this little backwater, nothing town called Nazareth in the middle of nowhere, right? And and labored there in obscurity for 30 years before he even went out to preach a single word. Father Uveland had spoken to Charles of the hidden life of Jesus of Nazareth, and he said, "Our Lord so took the lowest place that no one has been able to take it from him." And Charles became fascinated. He almost fell in love with this act of love that God made when he became man and became so small, became so simple, so that he could walk among us and be with us. And Charles decided, I want to be just like Jesus. I want to be small. I want to do the smallest things. I want to go to the most lonely places, just like Jesus did. So he goes off to Nazareth, actually goes right to the Holy Land. And he's there for a few months, and he's praying and discerning. And in that time, he just, he's kind of like, what am I going to do with my life? He comes to the conclusion that he should become a Trappist monk. Okay, so we know the Trappists, right? They're down at the Abbey of the Genesee. We have Trappists in our own diocese. He's going to go become a Trappist monk. And this kind of matches with what he's doing, because Trappists were pretty, hardcore monks. They lived very simply, and he wanted to live simply and in poverty. And he goes and he's with the Trappists for 7 or 8 years, and it's a very beautiful time. But all through the 7 or 8 years, he's growing in his spiritual life, he's growing in his prayer life, and this vocation that he feels he has to be very small and to live in utter poverty like Jesus did in a very far away place just doesn't feel like it's being responded to in the Trappists. There's like a mismatch. And he's talking to his superiors, and he's talking to his spiritual directors. And so finally they agree, this is not, we agree with you. This is not the right place for you. We do not know what the right place for you is. So in 1896, he's been there for 8 or 9 years or 7 years. He gets permission to leave. And what does he do? He goes back to Nazareth. And now he's got it. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to Nazareth, and I'm going to become a carpenter, just like Jesus was. And he actually goes to Nazareth and gets a job as a carpenter for some nuns that live in the Holy Land, okay? And the thing was that he was a terrible carpenter. He didn't know how to make anything. And he's only there for a few months. And the nuns are like really getting nervous, like, this guy can't fix anything, but they can also see that he's got a heart like you cannot imagine. So, of course, they're saying, Charles, or, actually his name was Brother Alberic at this point, because he'd taken the name Alberic when he became a Trappist, although he goes back to Charles soon after this. And, they're talking to him about this. And, maybe you're not really meant to be a carpenter in Nazareth. Maybe you have another vocation. Well, while he's with the Trappist, he'd spent a little time beginning to study for the priesthood. And at this time, someone says to him, I think you really need to become a priest. And this is like a turning point for him, because he starts to realize the beautiful gift that the priesthood is, right? Because a priest can bring Jesus anywhere, right? The priest can consecrate the Eucharist, confect the Eucharist. And so it starts to become very attractive to him. He starts dreaming about this. Like, I could bring Jesus to any impoverished, desolate place that he needs to go. I could bring Jesus there if I become a priest. So he goes back to France, becomes a diocesan priest, finds a diocese that will accept him, and then he asks the bishop, could I become a missionary? And by this point, everybody, this man is radiating holiness. Nobody knows what to do with him. And the bishop's like, sure, you can become a missionary. And he says, I know exactly where I want to go. I want to go back to Africa. I want to go to the Sahara Desert. And that's what he does. He leaves and goes to Africa. So here is Charles at the age of 42, so he's not really a young man anymore. He's been ordained a priest, and he goes to Africa, to what is modern-day Algeria. First at Bani Abbas, and then Tamraset. Tamraset is where he ends up settling. It's a tiny little village in a desolate, barren outpost in Algeria. A mix of characters are coming through this tiny little village, right? There's the Muslims, there's the Arab Muslims, there are the French soldiers, because it is a French colony, so French soldiers are always kind of coming through, wandering through. And then there are the tribesmen, who are nomads, the Tuaregs, who are also Muslim, but they're kind of like the most wild people you can imagine. They live very, like I said, nomadic existences. But this is exactly where he ends up settling, in this very desolate, far away, forbidden place. His missionary goal was to be present as the Lord was, small, willing, available. He wants to labor in ordinary, simple ways, human ways, that would open the hearts of these people to Christ. From this time, he was known as Brother Charles. He's also called now, often people call him the universal brother, brother to all, and that's what he wanted to be. He was going to become a brother to everyone. The Muslims, the Arabs and the Tuaregs, and also the soldiers that would come through. He built a little home there, a little hut, really, where he had a little, what he called the fraternity, and essentially he was available to whoever came. He ministered to the poor. He ransomed slaves. He actually spent a lot, because there was a lot of slavery there still in North Africa. He ransomed a lot of slaves. He helped people in all different circumstances. During a famine, Charles worked incessantly to feed the starving nomadic people. He taught children. He ministered to the French soldiers that came through. Of course, they were happy when they could find a priest. And he also began to translate the Bible into the native tongue of the Tuareg tribesmen. He said that he wanted, and this is the quote, to shout the gospel with his life. I would like to be sufficiently good that people would say, if such is the servant, what must the master be like? He wore a habit, as you can see in the picture, and he had the Sacred Heart of Jesus affixed to his habit. But what he really wanted to do was witness through pure love. Right? He actually wasn't able to evangelize anybody. He didn't perform any baptisms. He realized that people that would come after him would be the people he was going to sow where others would reap. All he wanted to do was introduce them to this whole idea of the love of Christ and how it was transforming his life. He wrote a little rule, like a rule that you write for a religious order, because he had this idea that there could be a whole order of priests, and he called them the little brothers of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, that would come to this place and live exactly as he was living among the people. He felt certain that others would join him in this work and undertake this transformation of others, the lives of the tribesmen, through prayer, charity, and poverty. But actually, in the time that Charles was alive, no one ever came to join his order. He was in Tamarasset for 14 years when World War I started. Half of the tribes in the country stayed faithful in that moment to the French colonizers. Half of the tribesmen decided that they were going to start a rebellion. So this is kind of a civil war situation that he's in. Now, of course, Charles was in a dangerous situation because he was French and he was defenseless. He wasn't a soldier, and he realized that. And so he actually kind of built a little fortified hut for himself. It was like a little fort that he was going to live in, kind of like wait out all the stuff that was going on. He didn't want to cause any trouble. He wanted to kind of take himself out of the picture while all of the unrest was happening. But one day, it was December 1, 1916, some of the rebellious tribesmen broke into the hut. There was a group of them into the little fort he was staying in, and they tied him up with his hands behind his back, and they started questioning him at gunpoint. They kind of suspected that maybe he was hiding weapons somewhere in there. There was a rumor that had gone around, and they really wanted to find out if he had some secret stash of munitions there. But of course, Charles didn't have anything there but the Eucharist. Suddenly, as this was all going on, two French soldiers rode in to the space in front of the fort, and the soldier who was guarding Charles, who was only 15 years old, panicked, and he shot Charles point blank in the head. And so Charles de Foucauld died instantly in that moment in his hut. He had kind of like Carlo Acutis, actually prepared for this moment. His whole life, when he'd begun this religious journey, when he was in his 20s, he began praying the breviary every day, in the Liturgy of the Hours, and he'd written in the breviary, "Live every day as if you expect to become a martyr." And this was actually what happened to Charles de Foucauld. He died because of his presence, because he decided to become a loving presence in a faraway place. What was Charles's strength in that desert place all those years when he was by himself? He didn't have any companions in this journey together. He didn't have anybody coming to become part of his order that he was founding. The one strength for him was the Eucharist. The Eucharist generated his life. It gave him strength, peace, and consolation. In the rule that he wrote for priests, adoration took pride of place. In fact, and he lived this rule when he lived there, Charles spent 3.5 hours every day in adoration in front of the Blessed Sacrament. In May 1903, he wrote this in his journal. 30 years ago today, I made my first communion, and I received the good Lord for the first time. And here I am, holding Jesus in my poor hands, him, putting himself in my hands. And here, night and day, I rejoice in the holy tabernacle where I possess Jesus, as it were, for myself. Here, every morning I consecrate the Holy Eucharist. Every evening I give benediction with it. Charles's life and death are a witness to the incredible power of the Eucharist. It can sustain us in any circumstance, and it has powers that lie beyond time and space and human abilities. Charles had envisioned an order that would be formed to bring Christ to the tribesmen. Today, and you could go online and check this out at charlesdefoucauld.info, 20 groups have arisen that derive their spirituality from Charles de Foucauld. And these 20 groups have 20,000 members. 4, not one, but 4 religious orders count him as their founder. It's astounding. He died really unknown in the desert. This is what happens when you live for Jesus. I'm going to read one more quote from Charles de Foucauld. Right now, I am in a state of great peace. This was something he wrote in his journal. And it was actually when he was reflecting on the fact that he was recognizing that nobody was going to join him there. He says, right now I'm in a state of great peace. This will last as long as Jesus wants. I have the Blessed Sacrament and the love of Jesus. Others have the earth. I have the good Lord. When I am sad, here is my cure. I say the glorious mysteries of the Rosary, and I tell myself, after all, what difference does it make if I am poor and nothing comes of the good I hope for? None of that keeps our beloved Jesus, who wants the good 1,000 times more than I, from being blessed, eternally and infinitely blessed. So, what is Charles telling us? What is Carlo telling us? What is Elizabeth telling us? Seek your answer in the one who has lived and died for us. A God who becomes man, who becomes small, becomes so little that he's in the Eucharist, in this tiny host, for us, and seeks us out. Charles de Foucauld was not more generous than Jesus is. Elizabeth Ann Seton was not more generous than Jesus is. Carlo Acutis was not more generous than Jesus is. Each one of them was found by the one who finds the lost, and the lost are us. They were fed by the one who feeds the hungry, and the hungry are us. We might feel more lost than they did. We might think that we're more lost. We might think We're in a desert too, but Jesus can find us there. Thank you. Questions? You have any questions? Okay, cool. Nothing was like, you're like, I have to know some burning detail of somebody's life. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. How many saints are there? Oh, glory. Well, there's, if you go, there's a great website. It's called CatholicSaints.info. And that man who runs that website, Kevin Knight, or no, it's not Kevin Knight. Shoot, I can't remember. That's Kevin Knight is the one who does New Advent. I can't remember the name of the guy who does CatholicSaints.info. But I think he has 14,000 on there. And, that's including, of course, we have groups of martyrs. There are, in the history of the church, there were many martyr groups that were canonized and involved a lot of people. And there also, of course, there are, before the canonization process really got going in the early Middle Ages, in the 10th century or the 11th century, there were, there was still a process. There was always a process of people. It wasn't like people just became saints. There were always essentially three aspects to it, which are the same aspects we have today, right? They were recognized as living a holy life. They were, there was a veneration. There were people actually, visiting their tomb or praying to them, and there were miracles associated with that. And so before that, there were a lot of saints that were not, officially canonized, but they were saints, and we consider them saints. So, looking at all of them, I think he has 14,000. He keeps adding them. A lot of them we don't know a lot about, because in the early church, there were thousands of people that were martyred, and and we only have representative groups. Like, if you look at the Vietnamese martyrs, I think there's maybe 100 people in the official martyr group, but there were tens of thousands of people that died for their faith in Vietnam, for sure. Just to name one country. Yes. That's a really good question. I was going to look that up before I came, and yes, there was a miracle, and it was a miraculous cure, and I can't remember what it was. But I will tell you, if you want to let's say you have an evening and you're feeling really low, and you're like, I really want to be cheered up, go online and read a story of a miracle attributed to the saint. They're fascinating and beautiful stories, and they're always usually people that are, they are all people that are desperate for something to happen. So they're always amazing stories, and especially these modern stories, because, the people that it just happened last week, it just blows you away. Well, thank you. Oh, yes, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, yes. His father is I don't hear much from his father, but his mother has done a lot of interviews. I don't know if, I don't know if the father is just the person that doesn't want to be in the limelight, but his mom has done a ton of interviews. And she's a very beautiful person, simple, and, she did think her son was a saint. And her life was transformed by him. And she has a beautiful life. There was a beautiful quote from one of the priests that taught Carlo. He went to a Jesuit high school, and the priest said Carlo was like, the grain of wheat that falls to the ground and dies, because he said wherever he was, things grew. Wherever, whoever he talked to, wherever he was present, people's faith started to grow, which I just love that. I was like, God, if I could get that grace, that would be awesome. That's beautiful. Yes. What do you mean? Like, are there particular married saints that would be good to? Mm, yes. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Um, that's a really, really good question. That's the kind of question I like to think about, actually. Let me think about that. Um, because the ones, the married saints that we know probably the most about are Saint Teresa's parents, who were both canonized. They were canonized together. There is another Italian couple that, that was recent as well, and I know less about them, but certainly, that's a really, really good question, and I nothing is popping into my head to be able to answer it, but I love questions like that because all of these mysteries of the faith are linked, okay? And the body, we have bodies, and in marriage, of course, we seek a bodily union with our spouse, and we're seeking a bodily union with the Lord. So I think there's probably, probably if I went into it a little bit, I could probably come up with some stuff for you there, but nothing's popping into my head right off the top of my head. Oh, I'm sorry. Married saints. Married, yeah. So I mean, of course, Elizabeth Ann Seton was married. She did lose her husband. Yeah. So married saints. It's the married saints question is challenging. I teach the deacons, in the diocese. They study at St. Bernard's, and actually, I teach deacons from 4 dioceses, and they often ask me, because most of them are married, could we talk more about married saints? And it's not that there weren't holy married people in the church. It's that we're just now, with really the pontificate of John Paul II, really focusing on that. And it has to do with the canonization process up to this point. It's always been driven by either a diocesan bishop or a religious order. So married people, they don't, they're not a diocesan priest or, and they're not a religious. So you need there's almost an extra step. That is definitely being overcome now, though. There's a lot more people in the saints pipeline that are married, or that lived, lived a married life. So I think that's something, that's what you're pointing to is the future. And it's a great future for us, really, with the saints. Hmm. Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's a whole other thing. I do think John Paul II is really great on this, and but we're and I should say, with John Paul II, he's opened up an avenue and a way of moving forward, I think, in writing about these things that just wasn't there before. Like I said, I don't think there's ever been a question that, okay, I'll give an example of a medieval married couple. The parents of Bernard of Clairvaux, our patron at St. Bernard's, his mother is blessed, actually. His father ended up, later in life, after his mother died, his father went to a monastery. But Bernard of Clairvaux, of course, was the one who wrote these 93 sermons on the Song of Songs. I mean, he wrote about the mystical life as a marriage union. And I always tell my students, there's no way he could have written about that without having seen a good marriage, without having witnessed genuine, because he says that marriage is the best image to understand the soul's union with God. And that, how could we explain that? This man he was a celibate man who entered the monastery when he was 22 years old, except that he saw a beautiful marriage unfold before his eyes, which is his own parents' marriage. So, and they had a bunch of kids, and he had beautiful family, siblings, and a bunch of siblings, 1 sister and 6 brothers. And so I think that's a good example of the way that the intimacy between married couples has impacted, the theology. It's just that that's not been drawn out and unfolded. And there are tons of saints' parents, I think, that could be canonized. It's not that you don't have to have had saints as parents to be a saint. Like Carlo Acutis, where'd that come from? God makes saints. Parents don't make saints. but it doesn't hurt. It's like the situation with Charles A. Foucault. It didn't hurt when he had a cousin like Marie. Like, these things helped, and so parents, so beautiful marital love, marital intimacy, that images God's generous self-gift in every way in the family. That's gold. That's gold. That's going to bring saints forth. Yes. Yeah, I should, being where we are, I should know. I know. Okay, sorry. The question was, where is Fulton Sheen's canonization cause? It's paused right now, is what I understand. In fact, I was kind of gunning to put some cool stuff about Fulton Sheen up on our website, and we had to talk about it at St. Bernard's. We're like, well, we're just going to wait till we see the cause move forward, and then we'll go with that, because just because we're you have to kind of let the church guide you in these things. So it's paused, but I don't know where it is in the pause. I would like to know. I should know that. That's a really good question. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much. This is great joy for me, and happy to be here at St. Paul's and Webster. Thank you.
All right, a huge thank you again. See, isn't she wonderful? You sit here and you hear her, and everything, the saints just come alive like they're in front of you. And, all the imagery when you speak is wonderful, and I so appreciate it. Just a reminder, we do have our books, Becoming Eucharistic People, in the back. So if you haven't had one, feel free to take one. We just ask you one per family. And then we should be, if you're following along, we're around chapter 3. And on June 8th, we will be talking about that in greater detail, about the book. Also, in 2 weeks, we're going to have a presentation on living a Eucharistic life, peace, justice, and defeating racism. We have our speaker, Shane Wagon, who is going to come in, and he is the co-founder of the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project. So it's going to be fantastic. He's already sent me the slides. And then on March 8th, Father Peter Matola will be our next Eucharistic revival speaker on the hidden roots of the Eucharist in the Old Testament. And he is the pastor at Peace of Christ Parish and the judicial vicar for the diocese, and a professor at St. Bernard's School as well. So we hope you can come to the next 2 presentations, and we have our books. And thank you again, Professor Lickona, for being with us.